Hello, this is Craig DeLarge. I made this recording for this Sunday's book discussion, the NAMI Sunday Forum at Ardmore Presbyterian, in as much as I'm not able to be there because of a trip that I needed to make to Singapore. What I've been asked to do was to kind of go through my impressions of the book to support the discussion that Ingrid Waldron will be leading. And so I'm doing this a bit off the cuff. And as you can see, I'm in a hotel room in Singapore, actually, as we speak. And so bear with me as I walk through the key points of the discussion. And I hope that this will be a helpful contribution to the discussion that goes on after this video is shown. And also forgive that it's going to be a little choppy as I'm going to speak a bit and then pause a bit as I go through this. And so what I want to do here is talk about the reasons why this book, Resilience by Jesse Close, Glenn Close, and Pete Early were attractive to myself and the NAMI PA mainline board when we thought about using it for this discussion. The key themes that really jumped out and resonated with me, including some of my favorite sections of the book. And then finally, I want to talk about some of the takeaways and intended applications that I think we should be thinking about as those who live with mental illnesses, care for those who have mental illnesses, and want to be in a position to best advocate for the progress in this front within the society based on what the book contains. So the reason that this book really appealed to me is that, the title Resilience, which is a key aspect of making it in life in general, and especially in making it in this area of mental illnesses and disorders. Resilience essentially meaning the ability to bounce back from some trauma. The other thing that was attractive about the book is that I'm a big fan of Glenn Close and her work. And so hearing about she and her family and how they worked with this particular situation, as well as the great work that she's been doing with her anti-stigma initiative, Bring Change to Mind, is another thing that really intrigued me about this book. So there are really three key themes that jump out for me in this book. The first one has really to do with resilience. In reading this book, there's a lot there, and I would dare say at the beginning of the book, where Jessie Close talks a lot about her experience of the disease, which is helpful, but wasn't really so much what jumped out at me. It was really witnessing over the course of the book, and especially towards the end of the book, how the Close family demonstrated the recognition of their need and their helplessness, though mostly in retrospect, to do something to address mental illness in their family, not just in Jessie, Glenn's sister, but also in her nephew, Kalen, how they continually learned and provided support, even when they didn't understand. They didn't push Jessie away, nor Kalen, but continued to try to learn and understand what was going on. The other thing is how they converted the tragedy of mental illness in their family, which, by the way, the book expresses was multi-generational. And after they got educated, they came to understand that this is something that was not only evident in Jessie and Kalen, but in an uncle of theirs, a generation before them. But how they converted this tragedy into advocacy and how they used their resources, which are extraordinary because they come from a wealthy family, to actually address the issue of stigma, which is what you see in the work that they're doing with Bringing Change to Mind. Some of the favorite readings in the book related to this particular theme is where, I think this is Glenn Close, this is around page 300, talks about how, and I quote, "I also talk about how our family had no vocabulary for mental illness and at what cost, how vital it was for us to educate ourselves and having the courage to start the conversation and bring support to our loved ones." In another section of the book, This is around page 33. Glenn Close is recollecting an episode that she had with her sister when they are children, and she says, "My most powerful image from that time of our lives, we are in the upstairs hall of Delwood. I think it is daytime, but there is not much light in the hall. I'm about 11 years old, so Jessie must be about 5. She is standing in front of me in a summer dress. She has 2 long blonde skinny braids that reach down to her waist. She is not looking at me, and yet even though I can't see her eyes, I can tell that she is upset. With her right thumb and forefinger, she is violently rubbing the soft skin between her left thumb and forefinger. She has worried it for so long that it is red and crusty. Sometimes it bleeds. I can feel her distress. I pull her hands apart to try to make her stop. She pauses for a moment, looks up at me, and then starts rubbing again. I don't understand why she keeps doing something that must cause her pain. In my mind, the scene has no conclusion. It is simply the two of us wordlessly facing each other in a somber hallway. I'm intently focused on what my little sister is doing, not understanding why she is doing it, and not being able to stop her." This passage in particular seems to encapsulate what the experience of being the caregiver of a person with mental illness is, in a very poignant description. Certainly we feel this way, the helplessness of despite everything that we do in trying to help our loved ones. But then, of course, that's what resilience is about. And then on page 101 in another section, and I think this is Jessie talking now, she says there's a tricky line between not suspecting and suspecting too much. Thinking back, I realize that even though Jessie had tried to kill herself twice, and even though she seemed to have no control over her sexuality and had gotten herself into an abusive relationship and was doing drugs to cope, in spite of all that, none of us ever thought that she might be suffering from a mental disorder. And this, by the way, is not Jessie speaking, but Glenn speaking, I realize after having read it. And then in another passage in the book, page 289, you begin to see kind of from the recognition of helplessness in the prior passages, we move to a place where there's some resolution that is taking place, although the issue is not entirely solved, not without, again, resilience and vigilance, I would add, in how they deal with this. So Jessie talks about, and I quote, "After the spotlight was turned off and everyone had gone, I went to my room, and for the first time in years, I felt good about my relationship with each of my children. Not only was I becoming whole again, so was my family." And then in another passage, this is, again, around page 289, Jessie again speaking, says, "Near the end of their comments, my children reached a unanimous conclusion. They said that the reason Kaylin and I had recovered because we had gotten excellent care, and they were grateful that our family could afford it, because many can. But just as important, we had come together as a family. Despite our faults, especially mine, we had clung together. If I hadn't been able to provide one of them," these are her children, "with comfort when I was at my worst, one of their siblings were able to do so." And so, again, in this area of resilience, and the resilience of the Close family in particular, this is something that really jumped out at me and stuck with me over the course of this book. The next area that really resonated with me from this book is the idea of stigma. You know, stigma continues to be the greatest barrier, I believe, that we have to addressing and improving mental illness and mental health in our society. As it stunts discussion and education, it delays screenings, it deprioritizes funding, both of a monetary as well as an educational, political standpoint. It shames those who live with mental illness and we, their caregivers, into too much silence and too much passivity and too little hope. And so this really comes out in the book for me. There are a few readings that really bring this point home. The first one from page 219, and this is Jessie talking now. She says, Tom didn't want to send Kaylin, that's their son, to McLean, which is one of the hospitals that they sent him to. But I insisted, and he finally gave in. Kaylin was still visibly confused when he was discharged from St. Peter's Hospital, and I was nervous about flying with him to Denver and then Boston. United Airlines discounted Kaylin's ticket because his trip was deemed a medical necessity, but it wouldn't cut the cost of mine. The ticket agent looked at us suspiciously when we appeared at the airplane. I could almost hear her thoughts. What could possibly be wrong with this seemingly healthy, good-looking young man? So wrong that he deserved a discounted medical necessity fare. If Kaylin had been in a wheelchair, the agent wouldn't have given us a second glance, I thought. But because he was mentally ill, I was certain that she suspected we were trying to cheat the airline. That really stuck with me because, we all hope for the day where we get to the point where the society recognizes that mental illness is not a character flaw or some unexplained deficiency in a person that does not require the same level of accommodation for how it disables that we have come to recognize in a society for those that are physically disabled. In another passage, this now around page 287, and again, this is Jessie talking. Listen to this, it's really interesting. She says, the more sensitive a person is, the more susceptible that individual is to mental illness. It seems like a sick joke that our universe plays on us as children, that the more it allows a person to see the world's beauty and deep connectivity, the more difficult it becomes for that person to maintain good mental health. In our culture, we tend to treat those dealing with that trade-off with a fierce double standard. As long as they are sharing with us beautiful insights into humanity, we will love and cherish them as heroes. But if they fall into substance abuse, depression, psychosis, or any other form of mental illness, we tend to say, it's not our problem. Interesting double standard, and one that we should all consider and that we're all working on as we battle mental illness. And then again, the book kind of goes from recognition to resolution, which you kind of see in these next two passages. This next one on page 300, again, Jessie speaking, and I quote, she says, in the 4 years since Bring Change to Mind was launched, as the three of us have spoken across the country, she's talking about herself, her son Kaylin, and her daughter Maddie. She says, I have witnessed a remarkable transformation in both Jessie and Kaylin. I'm sorry, this is Glenn speaking. As they begin to tell their stories in speech after speech, on national television talk shows, and in 2 public service announcements, they began to function better. They found their own voices, and they got stronger and more confident. We have since learned that all the research points to the fact that the most effective way to change people's attitudes about mental illness and their behavior around mentally ill people is for them to meet someone living with a mental illness and to hear that person's story. Becoming an advocate in order to help others can also result in significant recovery. I thought that this was a great point that Glenn makes in this statement, and that again supports the work that we continue to do in the types of sessions that we're having today, as well as in the work that we're doing with Family to Family and in our own voices. And of course, Ingrid can talk to you more about that. And then another passage to this point on page 300 in the book, and this is Jessie now speaking about a conversation that she had with her son Kaylin's wife, whose name is Meg. So she says, that evening in Toronto, I ended with a story told by Kaylin's wife, Megan. When she mentioned to her parents that a handsome young man had asked her out and that he had schizophrenia, they were horrified. When asked what had caused her parents to change their minds about Kaylin, Megan simply said, they met him. And so, while we know that it's not always that easy from our own personal experiences, I think that the point to get across is that kind of complementing what Glenn had said in an earlier passage, it really is an nth degree of exposure to the fact that people who have mental illness are just people who are struggling and who are just as worthy of our love, compassion, care, and regard is something that goes a long way in the healing process for those that we love, for ourselves as caregivers, and frankly for the society in general. And so the third area that really jumped out and resonated with me in this book was, and this was a surprise actually, but I'm grateful for it, was Jesse talking about the progress in genetic research as it relates to mental illness, which is moving us towards an understanding of the biological and scientific underpinnings of mental illness, and I believe is a significant key to lessening stigma. I look forward to the day when we will be as rational and willing to fund, prevent, and advocate for mental illness as we have grown to be when it comes to diseases like HIV, AIDS, and cancer, which, if you'll remember, a generation or two ago, there was just as much stigma and blaming of the sufferer and shaming of the caregiver in these two areas as there is with mental illness today. So it should give us hope that we can make progress in this area, and certainly the work that we need to continue to do is around that. There are actually two quotes from the book that I want to read that really sends home the point and the message around this. On page 96, Jesse talks about the fact that, and I quote, the National Institute of Mental Health, our government's leading research institute for the investigation of mental disorders, has declared that a serious mental illness, such as mine, are biologically based and passed along genetically. Bipolar disorder is a mood disorder, which means it can cause you to go from feeling elated to feeling worthless within minutes. And then the second reading to this point on page 291, Jesse talks about the fact that Dr. Levy, this is one of her doctors, and her team assured me that our mutated genes, this is she and her son Kalen, could be a smoking gun when it comes to figuring out the underlying causes of our mental illness, where Jesse lives with bipolar and her son lives with schizophrenia. This is because no one really understands the genetic underpinning of serious mental illnesses. Doctors rely on clinical assessments of the symptoms they observe and have to decide if an individual has schizophrenia, a mood disorder such as bipolar disorder, a smattering of both, as in schizoaffective disorder or severe depression. Finding an intriguing errant gene could be the first step in understanding the biology of mental illness, and many researchers hope that this will eventually lead to finding cures. And so once again, this for me, in reading this in the book, was a point that lends a great deal of hope, and I think is an area that we need to continue to explore and support and advocate for the idea of continued research. The same, again, as has happened in the area with HIV/AIDS and cancer. And they're not the only ones, but those are the ones that most prevalently stick in my mind when I think about this topic. So let me talk quickly here about a few takeaway points and intended applications that I want to suggest from my reading of this book and thinking about it. So unfortunate things happen to all of us, and certainly, what we're dealing with around mental illness is one of those things. But we have resilience, and that is the ability to rebound, and that resilience comes to fore when the right conditions are put in place. I've witnessed in my own personal experience that it takes a combination of education, supportive community, and dialogue, which I've gotten to a great degree from the NAMI community, learning the appropriate levels of acceptance, but also control and accountability that are needed, and establishing appropriate boundaries. And then, there's no substitute for time. The time that it takes to learn, the time that it takes to become skillful, in how we interact with ourselves and our loved ones, and the time that it takes to heal. So that's one key takeaway, and I think are points for continued application wherever we are on our journey with this matter of mental illness and mental health. The second takeaway is that we need to redouble our efforts in addressing stigma. We need to do that through the normalization of these disorders and illnesses, like we've done with HIV/AIDS and with cancer. We need to combat perceptions of extraordinary violence that the media too much puts out there when it comes to the mentally ill. We need to facilitate public exposure to the positive and productive stories of those that are mentally ill, which, by the way, is another thing that we're seeing more and more in the media. So it's not just the media criticizing, but increasingly it is also the media showing that those who are mentally ill can be positive and productive in their contribution to society and their ability, or their resilience, I should say, to recover. And that we should continue to advocate for mental health parity and increased funding. So we have a law that's on the books, but we've got a lot of work to do still to make sure that that law is properly applied and that it becomes conventional wisdom in how healthcare is administered and delivered. And then the third piece is, or takeaway is, we need to continue to follow the progress of genetic research as it relates to mental illness and be ready to take advantage of the benefits that will come from that research, but also be there to be gatekeepers to quell the various abuses or misuses of that research as it relates to the mentally ill that might come up. And so, I hope that this, not as short as I thought it was going to be, but kind of preface and contribution to this discussion will be helpful. And at this point, I'll turn it over to Ingrid to conduct the actual discussion. You guys be well. I wish you health and wellness and peace and ease as you continue on your varied journeys, either as one who lives with mental illness. Certainly we're all susceptible to mental illness if we don't take care of ourselves. And many of us are caregivers of those who are mentally ill. So be well, and wish me well here in Singapore, and I hope to see you guys at some point in the future when I come back to the United States. Bye-bye.